Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And this is a podcast where we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest, I'm really happy to have on. I've just read his latest book, which is called Murder on Federal Street, which is here. It's about the lightweight Tyrone Everett, but he goes into much more. But before we talk about that, I'd like to introduce him. His name is Sean Nam, and he's here to talk to me today. Hello, Sean.
Hey Chris, how's it going?
Very well, extremely well. Again, thank you for coming on. Before we delve into the book, can you just explain to our viewers and listeners who you are, um, and why you decided to write about this subject?
Yeah, well, I've been writing about boxing for close to 7, 8 years at this point. And a few years ago, I had a friend and mentor of mine, Carlos Acevedo. He had the book. You'll notice the foreword is written by him.
Yeah.
And he suggested to me, he'd been encouraging me to write a book. And he floated Tyrone Everett as a possible subject. Now, Tyrone Everett is basically an obscure name, even in boxing circles. A lot of people who follow the sport aren't really aware of him. He's just not a name that comes up. But people who perhaps kind of lived through maybe the 70s might know about him because, well, he was involved in kind of two really catastrophic events. There was first the lightweight title fight, in which many people believed Tyrone had won, but he didn't get the decision. And so strong suspicion that the fight was fixed. Then there was the matter of his death, which occurred 6 months after the title fight. And he was shot dead by his girlfriend. And that was it. He was 24. There were packets of heroin on the dining room table in the house where he was killed. There was a witness to the shooting who was a male drug peddler who liked to cross-dress, who was also gay. And when all this came out in the trial, it had the effect of giving Tyrone Everett a kind of a scarlet letter. So if you know anything about Tyrone Everett today, it's usually in association with his death, with the notion that he might have been bisexual, that he might have been dealing drugs, that he might have been beating up his girlfriend. That was a charge that the girlfriend levied as her primary kind of defense, and it was actually quite effective. It garnered her a 10-year sentence. She only did 5, but the jury found it pretty convincing. There were several witnesses who came up to the stand and described events where Tyrone had laid hands on her. So that's all to say that the story had kind of been, passed down into Philadelphia lore, but it had never been properly told, in my opinion. And as I made my way into the research, as I made my way talking to various people who were connected to the fight, to the fighter, to Tyrone Everett of that era, I realized there was a lot more going on here. But first, the fact that you had these kind of two really tragic events happen to a fighter who showed a lot of promise and potential, I thought was already here. You had the basis for a story. and I guess in my case for a book.
Okay. So, like any good story, let's start at the beginning. What was Everett's upbringing like, and why did he decide as a youngster to get into boxing, or go into boxing, I should say?
Yeah, well, Tyrone was a product of South Philadelphia, and if you know anything about South Philadelphia historically, that has been a very working class neighborhood, primarily Black, but also Italian. South Philly is being gentrified at the moment, but if you follow Philadelphia news at all, there's a lot of crime going on in the neighborhood still, and usually it has to do with kind of intergang warfare. So it's still parts of South Philly are pretty rough, and especially back in the 70s and the 60s, Tyrone was, grew up in the thick of it. It was not an easy upbringing. He had basically a fatherless childhood. His father was around but not present. But he had an amazing mother, Doris, who really, really shepherded the kids, and the kids were there were 5 kids, I believe, in all. Tyrone was the oldest, and I think she helped deflect some of the more rough ways in that neighborhood. But that's not to say that Tyrone was exactly immune from some of the more, easy temptations in that area. He's on record saying that he joined a gang early on, then he got out of it. But when you get in, when you get out, these are things that you never really can say. And I think certainly when Tyrone was coming up as a fighter and making his name in the sport, it was kind of a well-known fact that a lot of the more unruly members of the kind of underworld in South Philadelphia attended his fights. I think he was, friendly with a lot of these guys. Throughout his life, and I don't think that element, the street element, ever left. And when you consider the circumstances of his death, I think that's pretty undeniable. Why did he get into boxing? Well, there's several stories that have been told, but it seems like he kind of fell into it. I think the story that was told to me was that he was going home one day and discovered a fellow peer kind of walking home with a trophy, and it had to do with a boxing trophy. And so we started going to the gym, and he didn't know what he was doing, but he was soon taken notice by a trainer there who decided to take him under his wing and try and develop him. So Tyrone actually got into the sport pretty late. He was not boxing as an elementary school student. I think he got into maybe in high school. In fact, he was always athletic, apparently, according to his brother Eddie, and so when he found boxing, he really took to it, and he showed a lot of promise, and it made some noise on the amateur scene. But even then, he was kind of not. He was not considered a blue chip prospect necessarily. It was no, like, I don't know. He was not LeBron James in high school or Victor Wembanyama. He didn't have that kind of hype following him, but the coach certainly saw something. He liked what he saw, and he developed him you know, in kind of atypical fashion. The Tyrone was a southpaw, which was rare at the time. There was a real stigma against left-handed fighters for various reasons. At the time, left-handers were thought to have spoiled the dynamic of a fight. If you're fighting left-handed against a right-handed fighter, there's an asymmetry that's involved, and that spoils the entertainment aspect of a fight. Your jabs are colliding, and so. But there was never really any effort to switch Tyrone, and I think a lot of credit has to go to that trainer, whose name at the moment escapes me. Jimmy Arthur, I believe. And if you track kind of his career and the way he fought, and certainly in the title fight, you can see why that was a wise move. It really brought out his strengths that otherwise would have been obscured, I think, had he been switched to a right-handed fighter. Now maybe I'm venturing into other territories, but yeah, that's I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but
yeah, it's interesting you talk about, because you have answered my question and you've answered very eloquently, and it's interesting you talk about Jimmy Arthur. Now, with boxing, obviously, boxing coaches don't just act as coaches; they sometimes act as father figures, and especially with Everett, who came from a fatherless home. Was Jimmy Arthur that kind of, I don't want to say surrogate father, but did he act like a father figure towards Everett during the time together?
Absolutely, I think so. I think it's inevitable. I think a lot of fighters that is the case, and that's to say nothing of the fact that often it's the fathers who train the sons, and Everett, you know, I can't think that he would have had a lot of kind of righteous influences around him when he came up. Certainly, I think Jimmy Arthur had to have been one. Jimmy Arthur, I think he made kind of a living at one point taking care of horses at a racetrack. But I think that's particularly salient here. The notion of taking care of one's charge, being patient. Certainly the horse racing is a pretty rigorous sport, and the horses really have to be maintained a certain way. And for him to kind of go into boxing, I thought, okay, you had a fighter here who could be really sensitive to an otherwise very impressionable kid. I think it was Everett's great blessing to have met somebody like Jimmy Arthur. And again, I go back to the fact that he was preserved as a natural left-hander. And there were a lot of calls for Everett to fight differently at the time. This is a guy who really kind of stuck a middle finger at the Philadelphia boxing establishment of the period, which admittedly was probably mostly white. Didn't like a kid who kind of fought in a way contradictory to the style at the time, which was to come forward and bang and bash and give the fans a hoot. Everett was also not a shy guy. He was actually quite brash in personality. So that combination of being perhaps more of a defensive fighter and then also sticking it at the fighters themselves, that didn't really go down well with some of the older folks.
Yeah, indeed, and that comes across quite clear in the book. And you've mentioned the Philadelphian boxing fraternity. For those who are sports fans but don't understand, or new to boxing but don't understand what the Philadelphia boxing scene was like in the 70s, can you explain the intensity of that scene and also the quality of the fighters that arose from that scene in that decade?
Yeah, well, the subtitle of my book points it out, but it was a golden age.
Mhm.
And in fact, it probably is the last sort of golden age for regional prize fighting in America. We don't really have that anymore. The sport, as it stands, is pretty corporatized. Fighters fight according to the television cycle, wherever the TV takes them. So they're kind of taken out of their natural ecosystem where they might, where they could stand to draw a crowd and be built into a local attraction. That element has been lost. But in the 1970s Philadelphia, that was not the case. Fighters, there was no TV, so the gate was very important, and you had to fight for that. You had to fight for your money, and the way you did that was to be exciting. The fans had to have a reason to get out and pay, and that was in part due to fighters like Benny Briscoe, Boogaloo Watts. That period saw, the arrival of kind of Marvin Hagler. He made his bones in Philadelphia fighting some of these hard-nosed middleweights. Richie Cates is another guy. Trying to think of a few more. There was a whole cadre of these fighters who were not afraid to meet in the middle of the ring.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this is the product of a very young man at the time. You might even call him a wunderkind of some kind, and that's Russell Peltz. Today he's a Hall of Fame promoter. He's kind of synonymous with Philly boxing, but he was the reason why boxing reached the heights that it did in that period. There would have been no last golden age. There would have been no golden age if you didn't have a guy who was willing to not only put the time but his own money into staging fights. Basically boxing in Philadelphia had been in a pretty big rut through the 60s. There was a lull, even though historically the sport was a powerhouse. Philadelphia was a powerhouse for boxing going back to the turn of the century. But it was really with the arrival of J. Russell Peltz that you got these kinds of fights back into the rotation of the sporting life in Philadelphia. And Peltz had one thing in mind, and that was the consumer's satisfaction. Okay, that is a notion I think that is not apparent enough today. But at the time, that was what paid the bills. And so, if you weren't exciting, you just couldn't get on a card. And for Peltz, he had, again, Briscoe, you had Hart, you had Watts, you had Monroe. You had these amazing fighters who really made Philly boxing what it was. And again, I mentioned Hagler as someone who the story with Hagler is he had to toil for so many years before he got a title shot. But, he was prompted to come down to Philadelphia because that's where the action was, and that's where he could prove himself. And, I think aside from perhaps Paris at the time, Philly really emerged as kind of the middleweight capital for boxing. And, outside of perhaps New York, which I think was on the downslide, then you had Los Angeles out on the West Coast. Philly really, really kind of held it down for American prize fighting. Ironically, Joe Frazier, who's probably the biggest name in Philly boxing, didn't really fight there too much.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about this revolution, it really doesn't involve Frazier, who was part of the Ali story, which took him to, far-flung places in the world. The heavyweight game was completely different. But for this kind of middle tier level of boxing, which again does not exist anymore, in England, I think it's a different story. You guys are a little bit different there, but here, it's gone. It doesn't exist, and I don't see it coming back really. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, before we just get back to the book, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things, obviously being a fan, observer of the both the UK and US boxing scenes, is the UK seem to take the regional titles more seriously, like the British and the European title, whereas that in the 70s, I think they took, correct me if I'm wrong, used to take those titles a lot more seriously than they did today. Is that the case?
Well, at the time, I don't think there were, at the time, there were not really any kind of, the sanctioning bodies were only starting to get underway. The sport wasn't as fragmented. There weren't as many belts. So I don't know if there was a particular, I don't know, fascination with the regional titles. But the ecosystem was completely different. It was a fairly healthy ecosystem, and I think there was a lot more competition, a lot more people staging fights, and I think that made for a healthier sport.
Yeah.
Competition is a good thing. Today, I'm not sure. Fighters, can get a regional belt. They hand out interim belts. The whole process is kind of diluted. There are more so-called titleists today. We have fewer fighters than ever, and there are more titles than ever.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems absurd.
Yeah, no argument from me there. I completely agree with you. And it's interesting again.
But I guess I'll just, sorry to cut you off. I'll just point out, in England, I understand winning like the Commonwealth title. There's a lot of pride at stake there, and I'm not diminishing that. I think that speaks again to the health of the boxing culture over there on relative terms. But we don't really have that, and we have all kinds of so-called, there's like the NABF title. That's BS. I don't think any fighter is particularly proud of having the NABF title, other than the fact that it gets them closer to an actual title shot. But again, things are so fragmented here, and there isn't. There are no longer really, again, local fights being made on a consistent basis where you could perhaps develop a kind of prestige associated with a regional belt. It's just a sector that's kind of been lost. Even in New York, there are fewer and fewer fights being made in the city.
It's so carry on.
No, I don't mean to sound all downbeat, but it's not trending in the direction that you would want if you wanted to see the sport prosper.
It's a weird one, because especially, over here, like I say, you talk about the Commonwealth title, and then you talk about the British title, where even if you go on to for like winner, like one of a bout at world level, there is a certain, especially because with the British title, if you win it 3 times, you get it for keeps. So there's that prestige, that history there. And like you say, I don't know if that's the case in like American boxing, or indeed if it ever was the case. It's certainly less now than it was like a few decades ago, sadly.
Yeah, again, we don't really have an equivalent.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully something will change. Hopefully things will change. Hopefully, I always try to be the optimist when it comes to boxing. It can be hard at times.
Really?
I try to be, because if I wasn't, it would be hard to like follow a sport. So, like, I'll give you an example. So you have Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, they're both questioning the sanctioning bodies, both of them quite a few times. So if more boxers start doing that and asking what happens with the percentage they have to give, who knows? Maybe it'll change. It might be different 10 years time. I'm not saying it will be, but I have to be an optimist, because otherwise I wouldn't be as deeply involved in the sport as I am. Absolutely. But going back to the previous point you made with Philadelphia boxing, they're people who are all out brawlers. I take it like into like really brutal fights. And Everett wasn't like that, was he? Can you just kind of explain it before, but can you describe his style of boxing and why he didn't adhere himself to the Philadelphia boxing fraternity?
Yeah, as I was talking about, the ethos of the period was that you met your guy in the middle of the ring and you brawled, and that was the promise you gave to a Philadelphia fight fan. Again, just it's another notion that is lost today. People now, you have fans that expect to see 2 guys flit jabs for 12 rounds and then call it a day. Like that's more or less accepted. You see fights greenlit basically with the expectation that is how these 2 fighters are going to proceed in a main event. You couldn't do that in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Russell Peltz was not going to do that. That's where Tyrone Everett really was kind of a thorn in the presence of the Philadelphia boxing constituency. He was, again, as I mentioned, he was a southpaw, which automatically distinguished him from the rest of the fray. Then at that, he was a defensive-minded fighter. He didn't like to get hit. He was a very vain guy. He cared about his face. He repeatedly mentioned about the fact that he liked not getting hit. He was a handsome guy, by the way. That should not be overlooked. He was a handsome guy, and he really brought out a different kind of fight fan. to his fights, namely women. Women certainly weren't going to go see Benny Briscoe the way they were flocking to see Tyrone Everett, even though Briscoe objectively was perhaps the more exciting fighter.
Mhm.
Um, but Tyrone, nonetheless, had pretty significant power, sneaky power, and this is where Peltz had a lot of issues because he thought Tyrone could really stand to become more of an exciting fighter. He had the power. He showed that he could knock guys out. He had the speed. He had all the attributes where he could take a few more risks in a fight to get a guy out early and make a statement. Um, and Tyrone would have moments where he would go and put on a spectacular performance, and the roof would, the Spectrum Arena where a lot of these fights took place would just go off, and then he would follow that up with another kind of more pedestrian performance where he goes the distance, and he's moving around, and then he's jabbing away, but he's not trying to get in the mix. So that was kind of a perpetual give and take kind of situation between him and Russell Peltz. They had a very kind of ornery relationship. Peltz would, say something snide towards Tyrone. Tyrone would jibe back at Peltz. And you have to remember, these guys were in their 20s. They're kids. So it was really kind of a unique period, a unique relationship. Not all promoters are really, today you have perhaps like somebody like Eddie Hearn, who is going to, you know, praise his fighters to no end. If you're signed with Eddie Hearn, he's gonna sing your praises. And that wasn't exactly the case with Peltz with Tyrone. In many ways, Russell was Tyrone's harshest critic, but it came out of a really genuine place. He thought Tyrone could really step it up and become something else. And I think that potential, again, he saw a lot of potential in this kid. That's something I try to get across in the book, is as obscure as Tyrone is today, he really was somebody that was on the cusp of doing some special things. And again, it's a theme that you can trace back eons in kind of the stories that have been told, the literature, the notion of the wasted talent. I try to make that clear, how special he was, and um, how it seemed like everything had lined up for the guy, and he felt it too. You could tell he felt it, that he was going places, and then it just he didn't get there.
Yeah. You talked about that conflict between Peltz and Everett, and it seems weird because obviously they said Peltz was actually in his 20s when he became a promoter and at height. And one of the things I gather from the book is that Everett wasn't as necessarily a crowd pleaser, and as such, obviously the fans weren't flocking to see him. And would it be right to say that Peltz lost quite a bit of money, at least initially, on Everett?
Yeah, it's hard to say. The Peltz was not a Peltz was a you know he's a calculating guy, and he had to be. This is a kid who's just came out of journalism school, worked a newspaper job, and decided he wanted to go full time into promotion, boxing promotion. I mean, what promotion means is you're putting up the money, and early on, I think Tyrone would have been paid probably peanuts, to appear on the undercard of kind of a Benny Briscoe show, which was often the case. I'm not sure that Peltz necessarily lost money on Tyrone. He might have lost money maybe in the main event of some of the fights. It was touch and go early on for Peltz, certainly, but that was almost to be expected. There was nobody. On the one hand, there was nobody else doing promoting shows, but on the other hand, the fight crowd was not as what it used to be. Fights have been deprived for a number of years, so there was no momentum. But I think, and this is one of the more interesting things that I've found out about Tyrone and of that period, as I was researching the book, was that Tyrone actually was a ticket seller. Aside from Benny Briscoe, he was probably the top ticket seller in Philly boxing at the time. There is a reason why the indoor record for attendance for a boxing match in Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania, is still the lightweight title between Tyrone Everett and Alfredo Escalera in 1976. As Tyrone was beginning to make noise, and people in Philadelphia are starting to figure out who this guy is, and the boxing world is beginning to notice him because he's coming up in the rankings. He's actually become a reliable ticket seller in his hometown. So that was, to me, an interesting point, because you hear about this kind of great period where there is correlation between the appeal of a fighter and the number they generate at the box office. And Tyrone was certainly, he's not talked about, when we talk about the 1970s Philadelphia boxing scene, we talk about the middleweights primarily, because they put on the exciting shows at the time. And Tyrone often isn't mentioned. He's a smaller fighter. He fought differently. But then you look at the gates he was generating, and they were healthy numbers. They were healthy numbers. Thousands would show up to his fight. So again, when I talk about potential, there was considerable appeal he had, particularly for that kind of South Philadelphia section. They really came out for him. And when he died, heard it from multiple people who kind of remember the event, but also from newspaper reports. Reportedly there were thousands of people at his wake. It was like if Elvis had died, Yeah.
So bearing that in mind, and we'll get to the title fight and the circumstances around his death in a minute, but bearing that in mind, there's thousands of people in his wake. Why do you think he faded out of existence, out of people's minds, so to speak? Because as you say, when you talk about the great Philadelphia boxers, talk about Willie Monroe, Eugene Hart, Benny Briscoe, etc., but not really Tyrone Everett, and yet thousands of people turned back his wake. So he seemed to be very popular locally. Was it the division he was in? Was it his fighting style? Like, why has he faded out of it, obscurity in the minds of a lot of boxing writers?
Yeah, it's something I try to grapple with in the book. I suspect a lot of it has to do with the fact that, well, people forget. I think people tend to forget. And today, There's no visible record. For instance, go on YouTube and look up Tyrone Everett. You're not going to find much. I think for a long time, his title fight was not available on YouTube. I think recently, as early as the beginning of this year, somebody put it back up. This is not a guy. This is to say, this is not a guy where there's just reams of video evidence of the way he fought. In other words, where we can go and look up Aaron Pryor or Sugar Ray Leonard and watch their fights and get to know this guy. That hasn't been the case. So it's another really kind of tragic element, because Tyrone had just missed out on what would have been what would have been the cusp of another kind of wave of network television getting involved in boxing again. And I think given his standings in the rankings and the direction he was headed, he would have been involved in some major fights that would have been televised on something like ABC, and then you had the rebirth of Atlantic City. That would have also been a great home for Tyrone. He had a childhood friend, Matthew Saad Muhammad. Yeah. Perhaps the single most exciting fighter to emerge out of Philadelphia boxing. Mm-hmm. He headlined shows in Atlantic City. We know him because, we've seen his fights. We can see his fights. We can see the fights with like Marvin Johnson and Yaki Lopez, and you can see what he's all about. There's nothing like that in Tyrone's body of work. He didn't get a chance to do that. But again, it was too early. Had he fought somebody like Arguello, or let's say even Roberto Duran, which was rumored, we would have a little bit of a better idea of this guy. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't to be.
Yeah, it's very sad. And he talks about right at the beginning, there was two momentous, moments we speak about Tyrone Everett. And the first one of those is his world title fight against Escalera. Going into the fight, who was it? I'm trying to forget. Was he the favourite in going to the fight? And also, can you explain basically very briefly how the fight played out, and also what was the verdict and why it's still seen as a very controversial fight even today?
Yeah, I think it was by most accounts, by most people who observed the fight, who were at the fight, it was a miscarriage of justice. Mm-hmm. Tyrone seemed to handle Escalera pretty easily for 15 rounds. There was a dicey period late in the fight where Tyrone suffers a head clash and blood begins to pour from his forehead. Mm-hmm. But instead of retreating into a shell, Tyrone fights even more valiantly than before. And it seemed in the minds of a lot of the writers who were at the fight that this was an easy decision for Tyrone. Again, this fight took place in his hometown. He was the challenger to a guy known for his punching prowess. It was a split decision in favor of Escalera. And what really took everybody by surprise was the fact that the judge who had scored it for Tyrone, had scored it for Escalera, was one of Philadelphia's own, the veteran Lou Tress. Lou Tress had been, judging fights since, perhaps even the 40s. I mean, he's one of these guys who've been in the sport for a long time. He was a lifer. And, Russell Peltz just could not. Russell Peltz just could not believe it. He could not believe that somebody could get it so wrong, who was from Philadelphia and who supposedly knew what they were looking at. And that's where the seeds of suspicion start to sprout. After the fight, Tyrone Everett, after the announcement, after the scorecards were read, Frank Gelb, who was Tyrone's manager, Frank Gelb was lucky to speak to quite a bit for this book. Remembered Lou Tress going up the stairs rapidly, beating a path for the exits. And he was like, that seems a little strange.
Yeah, it seems the whole thing just seemed really weird. Absolutely. And I'm trying to think, is it 3 or 4 months from that fight to Everett's death? So it's a pretty short space of time. Before we just get to the circumstances surrounding his death, what was Everett doing before then? Was there talk of a rematch? Was there talk of doing possibly another eliminator before another rematch? Like in terms of his boxing career before his world title fight and his passing, what was the talk in terms of his boxing career? What plan did his promoter and manager have for him?
Yeah, I think he had 2 more fights, but the idea was to pursue a rematch, and the sides were pretty much in agreement at the time of his death. 6 months since the title fight, the arrangements had been made to stage the fight in Puerto Rico, so on Escalera's turf, home turf. And, I'm not sure the conditions were especially favorable for Tyrone, but, he had to think that he had this guy's number and felt that he could beat him anywhere.
But sadly, it never came to be because, I say, about 6 months after this title fight, he passed away. The day of his passing, basically, from what we know from police reports and newspaper reports, what actually happened that day and what led to his death, because did it involve his girlfriend as well?
Yeah, so 6 months later, Tyrone is found dead, shot in the face, hunched over his bed on the second floor of a row home in South Philadelphia, not far from where his own home is. And it's late morning, and he's pronounced dead on the scene. Later on, the bullet is found across the street. The gun is never recovered. The alleged perpetrator is the girlfriend, Carolyn McKendrick. Actually, one of several girlfriends he had at the time. But it appears that Carolyn was the one he was really going steady with. It was a shocking It was a shocking incident, to say the least. Nobody really saw this coming. And when the trial got underway, a lot of unsavory details, whether they were true or not, started to emerge. There was talk that maybe, Tyrone wasn't dead. He was using his newly bought bar as a front for selling drugs. Again, I mentioned that the house belonged to Carolyn McKendrick, the girlfriend, where he was found dead. And on the dining room table, there were, I believe, 39 packets, carefully packaged packets. I mean, it was evident that they were for distribution of heroin on a table. For prosecutorial reasons, the provenance of the drugs were never revealed in the trial. They simply had to, the prosecution simply had to kind of excise the matter of the drugs. We never got any clarity about that. The trial featured a witness, and the witness was a guy named Tyrone Price. He was a drug pusher. He was also gay. Gay black man who also liked to cross-dress. And when Tyrone Price entered the courtroom for the first time, with a padded chest, with big pearl earrings, and a highfalutin voice, you can imagine the kind of impression that might have had on the jury and just the crowd. This is South Philadelphia, 1977. This isn't 2023, where something might like that we would regard without batting an eye.
Yeah.
So you might imagine how the reports at the time really pounced on this story. You couldn't make it up any better. Hotshot boxer gets killed by girlfriend who thinks she found her steady in bed with another guy who cross-dresses. Their drugs. I mean, it had it all, right?
It's a remarkable story, and as I say, it's when I read the comments we said about Tyrone Price and how he came into the court, especially at that time. I mean, that would have been a lot of that jury. I imagine could have easily been swayed by that, especially because how people fought in those times. And there's one other part of this which is part of the subtitle of your book, which we haven't mentioned yet, and that's the Black Mafia. And you go into the last part of the book goes into quite a bit of detail about the Black Mafia and not just the influence in boxing, but just the influence in Philadelphia in general. So can you explain how big they were in Philadelphia, and if actually they did, not just Philadelphia, did actually spread across the country, and also what was their influence in boxing like? Was it a powerful one, or was it only concerning Philadelphia?
Yeah, so what I think is kind of my most important contribution to the Tyrone Everett narrative is his association with the Black Mafia, which had not been reported ever. When Tyrone died, there was all kind of street corner talk going on about how Carolyn, the girlfriend, was set up to do it, that she was simply the trigger person, and that this had been a calculated shooting, that it was not not the crime of passion that it was made out to be in the trial. Carolyn at the time was not just some girl next door that Tyrone decided to hook up with. She was in fact already married, married to a man named Ricardo McKendrick. So Ricardo, at the time, had just got out of jail. He had done some time for possession. But again, Ricardo wasn't just some random low-level drug pusher. He was actually a key member of a group that we now know as the Black Mafia. It's really thanks to the research done by Sean Patrick Griffin, another Philly native, an academic who wrote a book almost 2 decades ago, chronicling the kind of ins and outs of the Black Mafia. His thesis basically was, in 1970s Philadelphia, you had not a scattershot ragtag group of criminals, but you had an organized crime group made up of mainly Black men that controlled the drug trade, and in so doing, terrorized neighborhoods like South Philadelphia. And they were not shy about, they were not shy about using a variety of methods to dispatch their adversaries, whether that be people who forgot to pay their drug tax or pay a street tax, or for people who were witnesses to their crimes and were about to go on trial. They had no problem gunning them down before they got to that point. The Black Mafia, in short, I guess the easiest way to explain it is they were made up of kind of hard-bitten criminals who were really radicalized in prison, and also members of the Nation of Islam. And I think that's an important point. The Nation of Islam provided kind of the organizational principle that they needed. Nation of Islam, of course, is it's a small sect, but it really had outsized influence at the time in the 60s, and you had two of the biggest names in culture, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, as their biggest representatives. And the temple in Philadelphia, temple number 12, I believe, was kind of basically an outpost, a headquarters for the Black Mafia. This is where you had the Nation of Islam really pairing up with these members who are also, for the most part, very religious as well. Ricardo McKendrick, from what I understand, was not a devout Muslim, but his other cohorts were. So, as Sean Patrick Griffin outlines in his book, this was a basically a syndicate that had weekly or monthly meetings. They took minutes at these meetings. Things were written down, recorded. They had a pretty powerful legal backing. They had lawyers who could really get them out of any pinch. These guys would shoot at other people at voting registration sites. So out in the public, they had no problem pulling out a Glock and firing at somebody they had some beef with, perhaps earlier in the day. They would rope in one of their kind of key lawyers to come in and help them out. This is also a group that was able to commandeer federal funding and use it for their own purposes, which is not something you can say about kind of a street gang. These guys operated on a kind of a high-low access, and of course there were the drugs, and they were very good about that. And all of this was basically unreported at the time. The Black Mafia, the machinations of the Black Mafia, were covered indeed by a really prominent trailblazing journalist at the time, an investigative reporter. But in terms of Tyrone Everett and his death, and the fact that Carolyn was married to this man who played a key part in the group, it was completely absent in follow-up stories over the years. There was an attempt to cover the story. Well, there was a story in about the early 90s when a journalist wrote a retrospective piece about Tyrone's death, and he interviewed the brother, and the brother there mentions explicitly, he didn't think Carolyn had done it, and that he believed that Ricardo, who was this gang member, was really responsible for it. But again, it really wasn't until, again, the mid 2000s when Sean Patrick Griffin wrote the book on the Black Mafia that we had an understanding that, okay, there was actually an organized crime group running things in Philadelphia at the time. And so what I try to do in my book is make that connection explicit, in effect, giving the underworld influences that have been rumored to have been around Tyrone a face. And I think when you have that context in mind, I'll be very clear with you. I don't presuppose anything in the book. I talk to various people who have certain theories about things happen, about what happened, and I lay it out for the reader. My intention here is to provide the kind of context that you would have needed, that you would expect from this tragedy. And I do think that understanding the fact that Tyrone was basically one person away from the Black Mafia gives us greater understanding of perhaps the drugs that were on the table. Was Carolyn doing? Like, we have a better idea of what some of these questions that have lingered on for decades. We have a better idea of what the answers might be. I don't provide a smoking gun in the book, but I do think that in all, with this new context, it does compel us to think about Tyrone's death a little bit differently.
It definitely does that, and I love the detail of it, because I'd never heard of him before I'd read the book. So hearing that context and the involvement and the possible involvement in Everett's death, that part especially, that really captivated me. Just in short, what would you like Tyrone Everett's legacy to be? Because obviously he seems to be a forgotten person, even though he had a lot of talent. So what would you like his legacy in the boxing world to be?
Well, I don't know if I want it to be anything. I mean, I have to be honest. My purpose in writing the book is not to valorize Tyrone Everett. It simply isn't. That is not my impulse as a writer to kind of promote his life. In effect, I'm doing that. And I do hope that people become, more aware of him and his story. So from that standpoint, from more of a historical standpoint, that's, let me put it to you this way. I would hope that people who knew about Tyrone, when I approached them about, I talked to all kinds of people who, just to get a sense of what they knew about Tyrone, and they were familiar with his story. Almost the first thing that comes out of their mouths are his alleged bisexuality. Yeah. That he was shacking it up with guys, and the cross-dresser and the trial. That seems to be the legacy, unfortunately. Yeah. Not the fighter, not anything else, which is understandable. I mean, our culture is fascinated. The notion of the gay boxer is a very sensitive topic in the sport. It's a very masculine, it's a macho sport. It's a blood sport, perhaps even. So it's a fascinating idea. I would hope that, the book gives a fuller understanding of the fighter and of the person. One of the things that I do in the book is, in fact, push back against some of the traditionally received notions about Tyrone, including his bisexuality. The people kind of take it for granted. We don't really know. Yeah. We don't really know. As I explain in the book, that was a defense argument. There's no empirical evidence that he was ever in bed with Tyrone Price. And in fact, Tyrone Price went on the witness stand and said that he never had any sexual relations with Tyrone. But Tyrone Price also confessed that Tyrone had relations with other men. Okay. And there had been rumors going around. So we don't really know, but I do think it would be a shame to simply talk about Tyrone in terms of his sexuality, because so much of it is unknown. It's one thing to know about it. For example, Panama Al Brown. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, I know of him. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was talking to a fellow boxing writer, Jose Corpus, who wrote the book on Panama Al Brown. Now, from what I understand, Brown's sexuality was forefronted, and that was important because he played this was a very cosmopolitan guy. He was friends with John Cocteau, and there's a sense where we can talk about that in assured terms, whereas Tyrone, so much of this is speculation. I would want to think that we have a better appreciation of this fighter who was not an afterthought within this last great golden age of American prize fighting. He was a central element. As I mentioned to you, the box office figures were terrific. They certainly don't conjure up a portrait of a guy who is unpopular. I would hope that he would become more part of our discussions about that age, about that era.
Sean, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this. I've learned the book is fantastic. I'll put it up on screen again. I'll also leave a link in the description about where you can get this book as well. Sean, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this subject. Thank you so much for coming on the 286 project.
It was my pleasure to be here. It was a lot of fun. And thank you, Chris, for your questions.
You're welcome. Right, you take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.